So for those who don't know me, I am Jen Baker with the Hamilton Naturalist Club, and Brittany, who is also here, is also with the Naturalist Club. And just in case, because I don't know everybody, so just in case you're not sure, the Naturalist Club is a 103-year-old nature organization, volunteer-led, except for Brittany and I. And it's been working to protect and restore nature in and around Hamilton for that whole time. We've permanently protected 11 nature sanctuaries, so that's almost 600 acres, which is a lot of the work that Brittany and I do, is taking care of those. But we also do a lot of work in urban conservation. So we create pollinator habitats across the city, encourage other folks to create habitats by gardening for wildlife. So that's kind of a bit of what we're talking about tonight, and how to take care of our natural gardens. And we recognize these efforts through a certification program that people can get a sign and kind of just show their neighbors that they can understand why you are gardening for nature. And then we have our Monarch Awards program as well. So that's people that do a lot for sustainable gardening. Erin is actually one of our judges for the Monarch Awards program. So that's kind of some of the urban stuff that we do. We are also working with Environment Hamilton on a big tree giveaway. And so tomorrow, Brittany will put the link in the chat. But if you want a tree, you can plant it anywhere that you want in your yard in Hamilton. But if you do want a tree, tomorrow is the last day to sign up for your tree. All the details are in the link that Brittany is sharing. Okay, and then if anybody is interested in seeing some of the spaces that we've created, you're welcome to visit this site at any time. Or if you wanted to pitch in and help, you can join us Saturday morning, where we're creating a seed orchard, and we can fill you in on the details about what that is Saturday morning. But it's at our York Boulevard site, which is on the south side of York between Pearl and Ray. If you've gone by York and you see like a really big mural with some gardens in front of it, that's us, and that's where we'll be. Parking is parking is like street parking in the neighborhood. But yeah, we can describe like kind of what we've done and stuff like that, how we've created the beds, what kind of, we can talk about like some of what we're learning tonight, and kind of see it in practice. Okay, and then on to tonight. So we want tonight to be like practical and informative kind of at the same time, to look at what we should be doing to care for our gardens in the fall. What do we need to do? What do we not need to do? Both are equally important. I was lucky to get a sneak preview of what's going to be presented tonight, and I learned a lot. So I think that we're really fortunate to have our two great speakers. So we have April Lark and Erin Mallon. They they each have kind of different parts of what we want to do and what we don't want to do. So they're going to take it away, and they'll say more about themselves, but this is how I know them. And they can fill it in. So April is part of the Butterfly Rangers, which is this really cool program that is working with folks to get more pollinator habitat across the city. So really, really great initiative and fantastic people. And April is, and again, this is how I know her, but she is one of our volunteer extraordinaires involved in all kinds of things. Has just a tremendous amount of information and really practical things that we can do or not do in our gardens this weekend. And then we have Erin Mallon, who is now with the city of Burlington, but was with Conservation Halton for quite a while. And a lot of that was working with private landowners to help them take care of their property, so to steward their property. and as I said, she's also one of our Monarch Awards judges. So between our two experts, we're in really good hands to learn more about our gardens. So I'm going to pass it on to April.
So I'm April Lark. Jen did a great job of introducing me. I volunteer with the Butterfly Way project with the David Suzuki Foundation, specifically the Butterfly Way Hamilton. Yeah, I'm here to talk to you about fall maintenance for your pollinator gardens. So we can go to the next slide, Jen. There we go. Okay, so I just want to take a minute here to start off tonight with both an acknowledgement and a little bit of a statement on reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation report that was published in 2015 states that reconciliation between Aboriginal Canadians from an Aboriginal perspective also requires reconciliation with the natural world. If human beings resolve problems between themselves but continue to destroy the natural world, then reconciliation remains incomplete. When European settlers landed on Turtle Island, they made a huge error amongst many. They assumed that this land was untouched, that it was wild and underutilized, but this could not be further from the truth. These ecosystems existed precisely because people interacted with them. They maintained them and cared for them on a regular basis. And we must take this time to recognize the nations and the peoples to whom we owe the biodiversity that we enjoy and are working to protect today. I commit, and we must all commit, to establishing and maintaining a reciprocal relationship to the natural world. Reconciliation is not just about making a quick statement. It isn't only about educating ourselves on learning and challenging existing narratives. It's also about actively participating in the healing of the land and the water and your relationship to it. It is acknowledging and respecting the work and the love that came before settler arrival, understanding that Indigenous knowledge must be a part of the conversation when we look at preserving biodiversity and healing the planet. The city of Hamilton is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase of 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so let's get into it. So fall cleanup 101. So basically we do nothing. Well, almost. So gone are the days of clearing your gardens of all the plant debris, sanitizing the soil with fall tilling, and removing every rock and twig from our properties like they were the enemy. We really don't want to do too much formal cleanup when it comes to our gardens, as it disrupts the life cycles of those that we're trying to help. We tend to focus on nectar availability as a gardening goal, but we really need to start thinking about how we are supporting the entire life cycle of these pollinators, as many of them overwinter in our gardens. So leave the leaves, the grass mounds, the dead flower heads and stems, and keep any lawn grass long and unmowed. We spend all this time planting and gardening for pollinators, only to throw the next generation away with the leaves. Next slide. So our first item on the fall to-do list is to, again, do nothing. So just leave the leaves alone. Leave them where they fall and or pile the leaves around the plants, the shrubs, the trees to provide nesting opportunities and areas of protection for insects. Move any excess leaves from the lawn or gardens to a back corner or another area of your yard that will remain undisturbed until late spring when the insects have had a chance to safely emerge. We've all seen this quote floating around in the spring to leave the leaves until the temperatures are warm and consistently above 10 degrees. And it's a great rule to live by. Opt for a rake rather than shredding with a mower or using a blower, which can kill insects, eggs, and larvae. Avoid disturbing the soil below the leaves if possible, as insects such as native bumblebees can be nesting. Next slide. So most of Ontario's butterflies don't actually migrate like the monarch. Most of them will be under the leaf litter there for winter protection for their eggs and caterpillars, their chrysalises, and in the adults. There are many other species as well that live in the rocks, the logs, the stems, the leaves, and plant matter, including ladybugs, snails, dragonflies, mites, spiders, millipedes, and much more, which in turn support chipmunks, turtles, birds, and amphibians. Leaf litter also provides a food source for over 70 species of moth, which feed on not the live leaves, but the decaying oak leaves. Next slide. So here's just a quick snapshot of some of the beautiful Ontario butterflies that would not exist if we don't leave the leaves because they overwinter. You can go to the next slide. So Ontario's native bees need leaves too. So around 70% of Ontario's wild bees nest in the ground, creating burrows in the soil. The remaining 30% are cavity nesting, and they utilize dead wood, hollow stems, brush piles, etc. The leaf litter is used in the construction of the burrows and cavities, as well as provides insulation and protection over our long Canadian winters. We can kind of think of them as little bumblebee blankets. Next slide. So the second item on the to-do list, or to not do list, is to leave the stems and flower heads. So we want to leave these over the winter and into the summer, as they provide shelter for cavity nesting insects and a winter food source for birds and small mammals. They also provide some beautiful winter interest for our gardens. So how do you leave the stems? So in the springtime, we want to cut the stems with varying diameters at a variety of heights. So anywhere between 8 and 24 inches above the ground. This creates diverse nesting opportunities for different kinds of insects of different sizes. We want to leave cut stems in place throughout the spring and the following year, as they may be housing insect larvae, pupae, and overwintering adults. The old stems also will provide some structural support for the new growth the following year. And it'll be hidden quite quickly as the plants grow. Next slide. So our number 3 to do or not to do list is to leave the rocks, the fallen sticks, and the logs. So we want to leave those in our garden beds and provide, because they provide additional nesting opportunities for pollinators. Native bumblebees prefer to nest in sheltered areas, such as abandoned mouse holes and under piles of sticks and brush. Snags and logs also provide critical habitat for insects, including native bees, which then support birds and small critters and other wildlife. A fun fact that I learned recently actually was there's more living biomass in a dead standing tree than in a living tree of the same size. So they're pretty critical. They're a pretty critical part of our landscapes that are unfortunately oftentimes removed. Next slide. Okay, so this is when we actually have to get into doing a little bit of work. So number 4 is removed diseased leaves and plants. So you want to remove these from your gardens to prevent the spread of fungal spores and disease in the spring. So Monarda and like bee balm, powdery mildew, that love affair that nobody asked for. I don't know if any of you have the same problem, but every single year it is covered. I just tend to like pick up the leaves and the diseased leaves and dispose of them. The leaf hoppers can also carry and transmit diseases such as aster yellows, and this can spread pretty quickly. So you want to get all infected plants completely removed and destroyed and dispose of them in garbage bags. We never want to compost diseased plant matter. Make sure you're throwing it away in the garbage. Always clean and sanitize your gardening tools between each plant to prevent the spread of disease. Next slide. And our final item on the fall to-do list is to complete, and I think is the most important, is to complete a fall audit. It's incredibly important to understand the role of that your pollinator garden is playing in the ecosystem and how well it's supporting the pollinators and where there's room for improvement. You can ask things you can ask yourself are like, where were the gaps in your pollinator garden? What is your forb to grass ratio? What percentage of grasses are there? 50% of grass, 50% of forbs, like your flowers, are ideal. Are your blooming periods overlapping? Are you seeing that there's a period of time when there's no blooms? It's incredibly important to have consistency, as foraging ranges can be quite limited with certain native bees. How has the community changed over time? Which species have actually visited? What is the abundance, the richness, the diversity, sorry. What's relationships were present? What niches were fulfilled? Were there any mutualistic relationships that you saw? Next slide. Were there any invasive or non-native species on your site? Do you have a plan for containment, treatment, and or removal before going to seed? A great tip is unwanted plants can be a lot easier to remove from fall soils because they tend to be a lot wetter. Which plants and grasses were successful? Which survived, which thrived, which didn't do so well? Did they spread? Was there too much competition? And which ones volunteered to join the garden this year? I always find that there's one or two different species that just kind of show up out of nowhere to join the party. What nesting opportunities were utilized and provided? Were there bee houses, hollowed stems, decaying logs? Is there anything that you could add? Next slide. So this is all kind of leading to the importance of monitoring and tracking and just paying attention. How do you know that your pollinator garden, or on a larger level, a habitat restoration project is even working? We need to observe and record, which is unfortunately often lacking in these projects. And long-term monitoring is crucial to understanding the nuanced relationships and the health trends of our backyard ecosystems. One way we can, as individuals, ensure that our gardens are adding value and supporting the local ecosystem is by doing ongoing monitoring and periodic audits. We really just need to pay attention to what's going on. Over time, we've become quite detached from our surroundings. We've lost the language, we've lost the understanding, and aren't really listening. And when we don't pay attention, these slow shifts of a declining ecosystem go unnoticed until it's often too late, and the changes are so large that they often can't be reversed. So just slow it down and pay attention to what your gardens are telling you, because it's really a two-way conversation. Next slide. So you can be a citizen scientist. Individual observations contribute to the knowledge of Canadian biodiversity. This helps establish baseline data and monitor changes in species populations. You never know when one of your observations may prevent the spread of invasive species like the incoming spotted lanternfly, or turn out to be an incredible discovery. Some popular networks are iNaturalist, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, Bumblebee Watch, and eButterfly. Local pollinator garden and habitat programs are also allow for the tracking and study of habitat coverage and pollinator corridors. Obviously, our own Hamilton's Pollinator Paradise, the Butterfly Way Project, and Carolinian Canada are some of the ones that are available. Next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to go through some common questions and concerns that I feel like a lot of people have asked and or are interested in. And if we can go to the next slide. So can I take my leaves from other properties for my garden? Collecting and adding neighborhood leaves to your property can sometimes spread disease and seeds and unwanted invasive species. So I'd be pretty hesitant to do that. I would suggest maybe considering your neighbors or your friends to maybe just leave them on their property and explain to them the importance of doing that. In a recent study that I read, it showed that leaves often decompose faster when left under the parent plant. This is called the home field advantage, and it's due to a buildup of specialist decomposers in the soil around their preferred species, which I found quite interesting. Additionally, there are some complex issues surrounding leaf litter of an introduced native species that can alter soil chemistry and shift nutrient cycling, which can favor the growth and establishment of other invasive species. So, I mean, it's some things to think about when you're looking at taking leaves from other people's properties. Next slide. Should I be amending the soil in my pollinator garden? Should I add mulch? So leaf litter provides the same weed suppression and moisture retention properties as shredded wood mulch. The use of excessive amounts of the mulch can actually cover nesting opportunities for burrowing insects such as native bumblebees. We've all seen the examples of people doing the mulch cones, or 3-4 inches, and then just keep on adding it year after year to their gardens. but leaf litter provides the same kind of benefits while still allowing our insects to thrive. Should I add fertilizers or compost? If you're planting species that are native to your area and are in the conditions that they're happy being in, you shouldn't need to add fertilizer to your gardens if you're not cleaning them up. Decaying roots, leaf litter, and plant matter return the nutrients back into the soil that it needs. In certain circumstances, leaf mold and compost can be periodically added to the garden. The soil is very much alive, and there's a very critical role to play for that fungi play, and Erin's going to get into that shortly. Chemical fertilizers can also negatively impact the environment through runoff into our stormwater systems. And a recent study published in the Journal of Entomology in Brazil actually showed that certain leaf fertilizers which are currently used as an organic fungicide in Canada and the US, were found to be lethal to native stingless bees. So research on these sorts of additives to our gardens is pretty limited, and we do need to take precautions because the stakes are pretty high. Next slide. But won't all the leaf litter attract ticks to my yard? Yeah, this is like a big one that I've heard a lot, but life is a trade-off. Sure, your monoculture lawn will not support a large tick population, but it also won't support much else either. And pavement even supports fewer ticks. But most urban areas, you're not going to it's not at an overly high risk of a significant population. And they tend to stay in brushy areas because of the need for high humidity. What I can suggest is just protect yourself. They don't frantically run after us when we go in our yards, so you're good. They're opportunistic. They climb on vegetation, and they just wait for you to walk by and brush up against them. So a couple of tips are just you could reduce your lawn to wide mowed paths, or create mulched pathways, in the gardens, to give you a little bit of space so you're not going in and out of your gardens. Dress appropriately. So just wear long sleeves and pants and tuck them into your socks. And just make sure you're checking yourself after spending any time in the garden. Check any bare patches of skin near your waistbands or sock bands or your tight undies. They usually can be found quite easily. Reduce the risk of contracting it. As soon as you see the tick, just remove it immediately with tweezers, ensuring that you get the head. Clean the area thoroughly with soap and water, and just contact your doctor if you feel you need to speak with them, and then just monitor the area. I've had a few on me every year for the last, I don't know how many, but they're quite easy to remove. And I do checks every single time I come out of the bush or the garden, just to make sure. You can encourage a higher mammal diversity in your yard. Research has shown that areas with foxes and chipmunks, squirrels, raccoons, possums, etc., have a much lower rate of Lyme disease. Not because they have fewer ticks, but because these mammals are dead-end hosts for the virus. The simplified landscapes with only mice and deer are the ones with the higher rates of infectivity. Next slide. Should I be installing a bee house or a hotel? Currently, there's no convincing evidence that bee houses or hotels are an effective conservation strategy. They should only really be used for educational purposes and always used alongside natural nesting opportunities, not in replacement of. If they aren't designed and mounted properly, they can have the opposite results by being basically they're just going to be transmitters of disease and pests, and an all-you-can-eat buffet for predators. Remember that bee houses and hotels must be cleaned and maintained, and so they can't be mounted and forgotten. This is incredibly important to prevent disease transmission, and because disease and pest transmission can decimate populations over a single season. Next slide. When should I stop watering my newly planted pollinator gardens? So during the fall, the soil will remain warmer than the outside air, and due to this, the roots will continue to grow until the ground freezes. So the root growth relies on access to water. So if your area has not seen consistent rain, I'd keep watering your newly planted gardens and shrubs and trees until the outside temperatures are consistently lower and the ground begins to freeze. Any established native gardens after year 2, year 3, shrubs and trees, any of that, when they're planted properly to their growing conditions, they really shouldn't require any watering as their root systems are developed. Next slide. Fall is the perfect time for dividing and planting, like planting trees. That's available. Fall is a great time to divide your cool season spring or fall blooming perennials. Our warm season summer blooms, they should be divided in early spring, so leave those folks alone. The cool season, just adding plants to your garden, the cool season perennials, they can be planted up to 2 weeks after the first frost. So that's going to include your goldenrods and your asters and your spring ephemerals. The warm season perennials can be planted up to 4 weeks before the first frost. So that's going to include your coneflowers and your milkweeds, etc. Trees and woody shrub planting is highly recommended during the fall, as once the leaves have dropped, the plants are dormant and you don't need the regular watering and care that would be required during the hotter growing season. And dividing and planting is a really cost-effective way to grow your garden, and it helps to reduce and manage any of those aggressive native species that you have in your garden. The one thing I will warn is do avoid sharing divided plants with others due to the possible spread of invasive species such as jumping worms that we're dealing with right now in our area. Next slide. Public impressions and that neighbor. Consider adding signage to your gardens or property to educate your community on the reasons why you're choosing to leave the leaves, stems, rocks, logs, and plant matter. Education really is key when it comes to this, and often the negative opinions of more natural gardens are the result of just not understanding why they are the way they are. And taking time to explain it is oftentimes all that it takes to change people's minds. Consider installing a fence or a natural border around your garden beds or property. Sometimes that gives it a little bit more of a organized look. And when we garden for pollinators, we need to protect and create habitat to support their entire life cycles, not just for the pretty flowers lined up in neat little rows. We really need to look at redefining what we consider as beautiful. So next slide. These are just some book recommendations that I found super helpful and interesting over the years. Yeah, so I'm gonna send it over to Erin now, and she's gonna go over her some more information on fall maintenance for those pollinator gardens.
Thanks so much, April. And I guess as Erin's getting ready, couple of things that I love: doing nothing. Like, that is a great chore. I can handle that. I love the idea of the fall audit. And we're gonna start doing that actually at all of our sites, not just my yard. And then the citizen scientist. People use all of these. So if you're like, I don't know, nobody would use it, we do. So please submit your sightings. And they are used. So just, I'll put that out there. Okay.
It's kind of cool because it does have leaderboards, and you can add to different projects and compare to your friends and everything. So it's really
and learn about what's there as well.
Absolutely.
So we have great resources and these great free apps. So, encourage everybody to use them. Okay, Erin, you're up.
Right, so April did a tremendous job of giving us an overview of the fall maintenance 101 for your native pollinator gardens. In my experience, there's a couple of extra tips that and tricks that I will share with you now, kind of based on more of like the landscape. And I'll get into a little bit about what type of plants you can consider after you're doing your fall audit that you might want to add to your garden to kind of extend the life of it into the fall and even the winter. Next slide. April touched on doing compost and using leaf mulch. So I would say one of the things that you can definitely capitalize in your garden, especially if you have lots of deciduous trees, is to use that instead of sending it off to the municipal compost or mulching it and letting it dry up in your in your lawn, to break those piles into plastic bags and put some holes in those plastic bags, a bit of water, and then just every month or so, give it a good shake or turn it over. Continue to add water as it's dry, and that leaf litter will break down into what's called a leaf mold. The leaf mold itself is a really great, I'd say more of a soil amendment. It could take up to 6 months to 12 months for it to get to the consistency that you want to add it back into your garden. It's great for putting around plants. It's great in container gardens. And Jenny, if you go to the next slide. This is basically the consistency that you're looking for. It's just starting to break down. You can still have some organic material in there. But the reason why it's beneficial, again, it's cheap. It's something you can do for free on your own property. It's very easy to do on your own. Now, the main purpose of the leaf mold is to retain some of that soil moisture. So it'd be great in container gardens, and I would say it's pretty good for any of your native perennial gardens. If you're going to be adding it to vegetable gardens, you will probably want to add some different compost, just because it doesn't have a lot of the nutrients. It's more of like a carbon base, but the most important part is that it has this beneficial bacteria. It has this living microbes that help to continue to break down the soil and fix nitrogen. So you're basically using your own trees and leaves from your garden to continue to feed the soil, which again is just, you're creating that own little ecosystem feedback loop. Unlike other compost, it wouldn't have any odor. It's not attracting pests. And if it's coming from your garden, you know what's in it. It's not going to contain any unwanted weeds or weed seeds. Next slide. Another thing that you can do we're trying to be ecological about keeping our yards healthy. So if you do have a lawn and it's something that you take pride in, or you use it for a different space on your property, you're not planning on naturalizing in the entire area. One of the quick and easy ways to keep your lawn healthy and to reduce the amount of watering you're going to need or any fertilizer is to aerate it. Now, depending on the size of your lawn and how compacted it is, you can do it yourself. Aerating your lawn does alleviate the compaction. And the reason why you want to alleviate compaction is you really want to create more space for water to penetrate and to get kind of the air circulation going. And if you're raking or removing chunks of compacted earth, you're also creating airflow and movement, which is really great for the living soil, the microbes in the soil, and just kind of bringing it back to life. So again, that's just going to really get the roots to grow deeper, get a more lush lawn, and it's something that you can do it yourself. I would say wait till after you've had like a decent rain, so you're not working with really difficult soil. But there's also, for minimal costs, companies, you can hire professionals to come do it. They'll be very quick about it, and they'll leaving the little, like, I guess, earth corks is good, because that will break down too and help replenish the soil. So just something to consider. Aerating your lawn once every year or so is a great way to keep your lawn healthy without having to use fertilizers or lots of water. Next slide. Another important thing is to get ready for your freeze and thaw cycles. Oftentimes, and it's even happened to me, I'm a first-time homeowner with a rain barrel, I forgot about it, and that freezing, even if just a little bit of water left in it, can break the rain barrel or any of the hoses that might have water in it. So so yeah, be sure that you're getting on top around this time of the year. I know it's still raining, but take a look at the forecast. And if you've got overnight temperatures dipping to 0 degrees, you're going to want to drain those rain barrels and either store them inside or put them upside down with a tarp and just get them out. But more importantly, after you put away those rain barrels, is to redirect those downspouts. Oftentimes rain barrels are right up against the foundation and they serve a great purpose, but if you've altered the gutters or the downspouts to accommodate that, you should have a mechanism in place to make sure that when we're having freeze-thaw cycles or we're having rain during the winter, that water is getting well away from the foundation and well away from any of the impermeable surfaces. Next slide. And you want to get it away from impermeable surfaces to prevent ice buildup. So one of the best things you can do is stay on top of when you've got snowfall or you've got freeze thaw cycles, is to manage the snow as it comes. So staying on top of shoveling driveways and walkways thoroughly, like having a plan for where you're going to put the snow and not putting it in a place where when you have a thaw that it's going to create ice as soon as the temperature drops. And kind of planning ahead. Sometimes it's hard to know how much snow we're going to get. But if you have a small property, yeah, try and think ahead of some creative places that you can put snow in the meantime. And then another thing that I've learned over the years, if you're able to get ahead of, you know, if there's a snowfall overnight and you're able to get ahead of even just some of the shoveling, you can really capitalize on the sun, even though it's not going to be hot out. If you've removed enough of the snow layer and you've got a good, you know, couple hours of sun during the day, it will do the rest of the work for you. And then that dries it up enough that you're not creating ice. Next slide. And another thing that you want to do, April talked a lot about the importance of a fall audit. I would say in the winter time, you can walk your property during these freeze-thaw cycles and get a good understanding of where you might be having issues, where ice is building up and it's not easily managed. So if you're having areas that are collecting pooling water that are turning into ice constantly, whether it's over surfaces or, you know, if it's happening in the lawn, that may not be such a concern, but in areas where you feel like you have to manage the ice or it's becoming a risk. So note these areas as maybe it's not something that you can do during the winter time, but it's something that you want to flag that you can deal with in the spring or summer. If you're not familiar with rain gardens or permeable landscapes, those are just one ways where you can direct or redirect water into what we call a low impact development or green infrastructure for functionalities to get that water back in the ground. So there's two pictures here. The one on the far left is an example of a rain garden during the winter. Now it's might be a bit exaggerated for how much water there is there. It depends on the property type. But if you find that you have a significant amount of water running off and pooling and you want to redirect it further out into the lawn, you can consider something like a rain garden. When you've got your freeze thaw cycles, when your snow melts, it's going to melt in the right direction and it will infiltrate into the ground. Another thing you can do is consider if it's happening on your driveways or pathways, if you're putting in permeable pavement or permeable paver stones, when you're having those freeze and thaw cycles, that water is getting into the ground. It's not pooling on top of your driveways or walkways, which is great because then you're not creating the hazard of ice. And the good news about LID is that even though it's maybe a relatively new term to residential landowners, it's something that it's being incentivized by a lot of municipalities and conservation authorities. So if this is something that you feel like will be beneficial to your property and might solve these problems of the ice buildup or even water buildup at any time of the year, you can check your local municipalities or sometimes there's community groups, non-for-profits that really help to encourage low impact development through grant shares, grant cost share. So you can look into that. Next slide. Now, if you, I guess, in every case, you can't always manage your ice on the property. So if you're turning to ice management using salt and sand, just be mindful. We don't get a good understanding of the type of salt or de-icer that you're using or sand, and really understand how much you need, because you probably need a lot less than you think you do. You shouldn't be tracking, salt and de-icer into your house. If you're finding it in other places other than where you've put it, often chances are you're overdoing it. I find that they sell lawn and pet friendly de-icers at most hardware stores. Those are great for walkways, small driveways, and you definitely want to use it on concrete because the rock salt can degrade your concrete, and it's just not great overall for the property. Rock salt, which you can get in bulk, and it's a little bit more affordable, or using sand for grip. Those are better for large asphalt driveways or larger areas on your property that are would be too difficult to manage with a de-icer. And something to consider for using any de-icer, salt or sand, like you want to keep it well away from like any creeks, lakes, wetlands, of course. 10 meters is probably the minimum. If you have any of those, if you're lucky to have any of those types of features on your property, you definitely want to see about alternatives. And the number one is just trying to keep the ice to a minimum. And if you're in a rural area, know where your well is and make sure that you're not spreading any salt within that. Recommended about 8 meters from residential wells. But I guess, yeah, the take home here is try to manage ice and prevent it. And then if you do have, definitely for risk, just be very mindful of what you're using, where, and how much. Next slide. Next, we want to talk about wildlife over winter. So a lot of people see the winter time as very stressful, very difficult for all the critters and creatures that we love in our neighborhoods. But we can sometimes, and things that we feel like are good can often be harmful, despite, your intentions. So this is kind of a breakdown thinking about feeding wildlife and the general, what I would recommend is don't. Wildlife, is wild for a reason, and it can find food on their own. Oftentimes the food that we're offering wildlife any time of year is not healthy for them. And there's a risk both for humans and for the animals, where they can become dependent on the artificial food source and then they stop looking for alternative food source, which means they can lose their fear of humans, and which could be more prone to conflict. Another thing to consider if you're attracting, small mammals to large mammals, or you want to make sure that you're not attracting a lot to one area. That's just, again, we touched on it with the bees, but if it's harder to keep an area clean when you're feeding large animals. And if you are bringing them to a rural area, you're increasing the risk of road mortality, which is a risk not only to the animal, but your neighbors as well. Leaving food out, whether it's intentional or non-intentional, could attract unwanted pests to your home, into your home. And you need to be also very mindful of what the municipalities have to say about feeding wildlife. I know across Ontario, if you look up the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, they recommend, like across the board, not feeding any wildlife in Ontario. And certain municipalities have bylaws strictly against it and fines associated with that. currently work for the city of Burlington, and if you haven't heard, we had quite an issue with coyotes, and it turns out their behavior had been changed because they were being fed by people in urban areas, which that behavior led to aggressive. That change of behavior was aggressive, and it unfortunately led to having to eliminate four coyotes. So the same goes with kind of any mammal, small mammal, like raccoons, foxes, coyotes, any of those that get accustomed to feeding from humans can become aggressive. So even though it's something that you might be comfortable with having them on your property, your neighbors may not, and then that could lead to, that could escalate it to the point where they could be called. Next slide. So just general rules about, at home, don't put out food to attract wildlife at any time of year. Don't try and approach animals. If you have pets, indoor, outdoor pets, don't leave your pet food out unintentionally. You'll be feeding wildlife. And keep an eye on your pets too, especially if in your area has, if you see foxes or coyotes or even raccoons. And then another thing about unintentional feeding, don't be best, especially in an area where you know that there is wildlife with a chance that they could get into the garbage. Make sure you're putting out your garbage the morning of and not leaving it out overnight to be eaten, because that again unintentionally will change the behavior of the wildlife. But we all can appreciate wildlife from a distance. Make sure that our household waste, including compost, if you have outdoor compost, don't be putting things like meat scraps, just stick to veggies and garden waste. And then we'll talk about attracting wildlife to your property by improving the natural habitats. The best way you can enjoy wildlife without interfering. And then, as April suggested, working together with your neighbors to help keep animals wild by letting them, being transparent about why you're changing your property. And then if they're seeing animals come to your property, you can explain to them that they're being attracted only because of the naturalization of it, and it's intentional. Next slide. So I saw a question pop up about bird feeders. So there is there's been a lot of discussion and research on bird feeders. So I would definitely recommend the best way to attract birds to your property and provide food for them is through native plants. That's what the birds and the plants have evolved together to support one another. So there's lots of things that you can do to create a natural habitat and natural food and forage on your property. However, a couple of bird feeders can provide nourishment until spring. But again, it's not like a put it out there and forget about it. Be careful that you're using squirrel-proof feeders. You don't want to, again, continue to attract unwanted pests. And understand the type of the birds that you want to feed and provide that diverse selection of foods. Different birds, some birds don't eat birdseed. They rely on insects and grubs and that. So again, creating those little micro habitats for them to get their food that way. And if you're buying seeds, go for high quality stuff. Go to a reputable source. There's agricultural feed stores, or in some places in Southern Ontario, they have specialty wild bird stores that have really good feed. Next slide. Another one to touch on is the hummingbird feeders. Hummingbirds, we do focus on how much they enjoy nectar, but they also eat insects, spiders, known to eat tree sap, and of course plant nectar. So throughout the summer, you can supplement it with the specialized feeders. Just make sure that they're at least 4 feet high. That's to keep them away from predators, preferably in some shade. And the ratio of what you're feeding them is 1 cup of white cane sugar they recommend, or beet sugar to 4 cups of spring water. And with these, every time you're replacing it, which is usually every 4 to 5 days, depending on how many birds you have visiting, to give it a good clean, or put it in, give it a clean with some soap and water, and make sure that it's not dripping and getting full of ants, because you're just trying to keep on top of any of fungus or disease that might be spreading. And then they recommend once a month to sterilize it. Now that could be a very weak bleach solution, or running it through the a sterilization on your dishwasher. Next slide. But here's what I really want to talk about, is letting nature feed the wildlife. So if you're keen to bring wildlife to your property, the best way to do it is to plant things that they're interested in eating. And depending on your neighborhood, I would say take a walk around within like a few block radius and kind of get a sense of what type of vegetation there are. There's probably trees in your neighborhood, and maybe people have their own gardens, but maybe take a look to see what other, especially this time of year and into the winter, what type of vegetation is available that could be good over winter and habitat or forage for local wildlife. I would say looking for like evergreen trees or shrubs, and plants that have seed heads. The benefit of adding some like fall forage and cover for wildlife is that it has some really beautiful like textures and colors that can can extend the life of your garden even throughout the winter, especially like April said, to leave the seed heads on and just kind of keep that integrity of the garden all winter. Fall is a great time to plant, so just got to get them in before the ground freezes. I've been learning a lot more about adding mycorrhiza. So that's a beneficial fungus that helps the plant roots get all the nutrients it needs from the ground. So if you add that when you're planting, Root Rescue or Mike come to mind, but I can put some more information together that Jen can send you in a package about mycorrhiza. And just continue to water it until the ground freezes. And the leaf mulch would be a good idea. It's because it's help, you can amend that in with the soil because that helps with the moisturizer. And here would be a good place to put arborist mulch. Now the arborist mulch is just temporary for the first year or so, just to help with weed suppression. Next slide. So now I'll just go through, like, I picked a couple of trees, shrubs, and wildflowers and grasses that would be great for winter interest, and most importantly for forage and shelter. So the eastern white cedar, known as Thuja occidentalis. Now this is a great evergreen, probably very familiar with it. It's very low maintenance. It can do well in clay soils. It can do well in wet sites. It doesn't have much that will outcompete it, and it's really it can deal with salty to alkaline or moist or well-drained loam. So you really can't go wrong. You just want to give it the space initially to grow, but even as a tree, you can still, if you're in a small property, you can stay on top of it every few years just to keep it prune tight. So moths, the turnip moth and the pine processionary are some of the larval hosts of the roots of the eastern white cedar, as well as several, like you'll see overwintering birds and mammals will eat the cedar berries and find shelter in it. And any birds that are, backyard neighboring birds, they'll love to find this is a nice little hideout in colder, windy days. So I would recommend, if you don't, or your neighborhood doesn't have any evergreens, this would be one to pick. Next slide. Another evergreen is the Juniperus virginiana. It's commonly known as eastern red cedar, but it's not a cedar, it's a tree-sized juniper. So this one's another great that's really well adapted to like dry soils, like clay, compact soils, and it can do well with like if you're planting it near a road that's, you know, getting heavily salted. They're quite hardy that way. So these trees are great all year. So they can be good used for nesting sites for a lot of the songbirds, robin, sparrows, overwintering birds like juncos, as well as migrating birds like warblers. The twigs and foliage, you can see here they've got these little blue berries. Those are your juniper berries, and they're food that'll be eaten by many types of birds and mammals. And especially if you have one of these, chances are you'll see some cedar waxwings in your yard well into the fall and winter. Next slide. Here's one of my personal favorites, the staghorn sumac. This time of year, I have one in my yard. It's crimson red. It's quite beautiful, and they again are very hardy. They can take. They're great to grow on slopes. They grow to maybe about three meters. So they'd be a great background plant, and wonderful foliage. But also they have these beautiful flowers that come later in the spring or later in the summer, and the bees love them. They're also attracting Luna moths, and spring azure butterflies. And then later in the fall, you'll find things like the pheasants and quails and wild turkey will come and eat that fruit. So again, a beautiful fall and winter interest, but it's a native plant that a lot of birds and mammals can rely on for food. Another one is our native wild rose. It's a prickly wild rose. Again, it's very hardy. You can find it in well drained and moist soils. You can use it as a flowering hedge. So that could be something that, you know, don't use it necessarily as like a typical standalone rose. You can actually make it quite a big patch on your property. In the growing season, it will create really great habitat for bird nesting because it is prickly, so it provides that extra protection for birds and for small mammals. The flowers, you can see here, you know, they're a great attractant to our local bees, moths, and butterflies. And then when the flower matures, it turns into a rosehip. Looks much like an apple. They're just quite small apples full of vitamin C. So they'll attract larger mammals like deer, rabbits, squirrels, voles, fox, possum, you name it. So again, beautiful in the growing season, and then you get the pop of color with the rose hips well into the winter. Next slide. Lance leaf coreopsis. Now this is another one. It's great for when we talk about leaving the seed heads out. Now these have both ray florets and disc florets, and they get plenty of seeds. So this is basically, if you have a patch of coreopsis on your property, that in itself is a winter bird feeder. And you get the benefit of having these beautiful bright yellow flowers from late summer into the fall, and then it does just provide this instant food like well into the winter. It will attract lots of songbirds and overwintering birds with the lance leaf coreopsis. Next slide. Wild bergamot, one of my personal favorites. It is one that gets the powdery mildew. So if you have it in your garden, I mean, I've tried it even in well ventilated areas. So that's something to keep an eye on. But again, it's a beautiful hardy plant. It spreads very well after 2 or 3 years of being planted. The seed heads provide such a beautiful winter interest, and yeah, you'll attract lots of little birds Bees and butterflies in the growing season. Hummingbirds love it for the nectar. And yeah, if you leave the seed heads on over winter, you'll get an array of birds coming to enjoy the seeds. Next slide. The bottlebrush grass. Now, this is a great grass for, especially if you have a shade garden. It can do well in dry soils and in shady sites. It's just got this unique floret, which provides, you know, some texture, but it's food. It's seed. In the summer, it'll attract the butterflies, moths, and in the winter, it'll provide the seeds will drop or be visited by birds, and again, just creating a bit of a natural bird feeder for the winter. And finally, a cool season grass. This is just, again, one of the many grasses to consider, but I picked this one because it'll have this beautiful floret. Seed heads are like a silvery green. The grass is pretty well behaved, but these seed heads will attract your local overwintering birds, and it will be used in the spring to make nests for the birds. So we'll be able to take advantage of the florets. Speaking of seeds, now something that I recommend in your garden, to kind of understand what seeds and what time of the year to harvest seeds from your garden, because again, it's a very do-it-yourself economical way to expand your garden, and you can share the seeds with others. So they recommend in nature to harvest no more than like 10% from the patch. You can probably experiment a bit more in your home, but if the intention is to leave seeds for wildlife, then I would say stick to 10%, especially if it's a self-seeding plant as well, because you want it to be able to have enough, to release enough to grow the next year. April touched on the invasive jumping worm. If you're not familiar with it, I won't go into too much detail, but it is a worm. The worms die in the winter, but their seeds or their eggs don't. So they do have a way of getting around it for moving soil from site to site. So I'd say if you're giving away plants, we're going to get into the habit of giving away bare root plants. You'd have to wash the soil away. But a good way around that is just to share seeds, because the jumping worm is not an issue there. And if you are interested in harvesting seeds outside of your property, definitely make sure to get permission from landowners, or maybe join groups that have workshops on collecting seeds and learn that way. You don't want to go out into public or private land collecting seeds without permission. Next slide. Other ways that we did touch on, but to encourage habitat for small critters. So if there's certain things that you want to bring onto your property, again, if you just provide that habitat over time, they'll find it. So simple things like pile of logs that creates moisture. It's a habitat for salamanders, insects, and small mammals. Something simple as a pile of rocks. Again, you're creating a habitat for insects, which will attract small mammals and reptiles. They can use that for hibernation, or just a place to hide within the rocks. We touched on having a loose pile of tree leaves. Those are great for overwintering insects. Just make sure that you're not disturbing it once you've set it. And I've read things about placing corrugated iron. It creates this habitat for mammals, small mammals, to be able to live under the soil. They'll create tunnels for reptiles, amphibians, mice, and voles, as well as like untreated plywood boards. If you don't have access to like logs, you can create these little places for salamanders to overwinter if you've got property near a woodlot. The one thing I would caution is if if you're really interested in, creating like rock piles or log piles, be mindful of where you're getting that. So I wouldn't recommend going out to a conservation area and taking rocks and stones and twigs home with you, for example. I would say either find it on your own property that's just kind of fallen, or find someone who's got firewood and ask them for a few. And then once you've set it in the place, leave it. You wouldn't want to be continuing to move it, because once it's been there for even a matter of days, it's starting to become habitat already. Next slide. We'll touch again about native bee homes. So as April mentioned, the best way to attract and keep bees on your property is to create the natural habitat. So having some exposed soil, clipping your flower stems in the spring, just to allow more of a natural habitat. I would say that if you're using a native bee home, that's more of an educational tool and a point of interest to kind of see what types of bees you have on the property. And once you understand what types of bees, if you have leafcutter bees or if you have sweat bees, then you can start to understand what more of habitat that you can bring in. But I wouldn't say it's any sort of replication or a better substitute for natural areas. And I would really stress that the bee homes need to be the right size. They need to have the right materials at the right size, but more importantly, they need to be, they do take quite a bit of maintenance. They need to be checked, and if you want to overwinter the bees, we recommend putting them bringing them into a shelter or bringing them to the fridge. So it's a little bit more work than you might think. So I would say if that's something that you want to take on, you have to realize it's a bit of a project. And I'd say it's something that you can do for research and then kind of move on from there to find other ways that you can provide that habitat on your property. Next slide. And kind of similar with bird houses. Now, birds are great at finding their own places to nest. And if you are planning on having birdhouses on your property, again, it's a bit of a project. They need to be cleaned out at least twice a year, once before winter and then once before spring. And you want to make sure that if you're buying or making a birdhouse, that it has a proper way to clean it. Otherwise, you could just be spreading disease, from year to year. The other thing to be considerate about is predation. So if you're putting them on posts, it could be creating an opportunity for predators to get them easily. Or if you've got a birdhouse with a perch, that could be another way for larger birds to be able to get at them that way. So if you have a birdhouse, to keep an eye on it, and if you see any sign of predation, you're gonna have to move the birdhouse to a different location, and then again, just be mindful of what you're attracting to the property. Next slide. So that pretty well concludes just some of the tips that I wanted to pass on, but there are other workshops that are happening kind of related to this subject that I wanted to pitch. Conservation Halton is in the middle of their Healthy Neighborshed series. They had one tonight and they have another two next Thursday and the following Thursday. Again, that's about putting your garden to bed for winter, but in an ecological way. So you can check that out. That's a virtual workshop, so similar to tonight. And there is an in-person workshop that Conservation Halton's running through Mountsburg. It's a bit longer. It's a half-day workshop at Mountsburg, and that's again really drilling down on what you can do to be, ecologically minded gardener, and what you can do for fall, and that involves a bit of a tour as well. So you can actually go out and see some of the plants in action at this time of year. So if you're interested in those, you can look it up at conservationhalton.ca. Okay, that's it for me.
Thanks, Erin. I'm so gonna create leaf mold, partly because then if people come into my yard and ask me, what's that bag for? I'm creating leaf mold. I think that'll be fun. But really great tips. I know I probably wasn't the only one who was like, oh yeah, winter. Well, it is coming. So we need to just be ready and face facts that it is going to come. Not soon, but it is coming. So now we have some really great tips, some really good species selections, because it's always good to get tips for different species. So as both of you were speaking, I just kept thinking, we are so lucky in this community to have so many experts who are willing to like spend the time to share these tips that we can, you know, well, a lot of which is do nothing and just kind of watch what's going on, but you know, like that are willing to spend the time to share that. So I wanted to thank both of you very much for giving us such practical knowledge.